So our session tonight is the Episcopal Church and our history. It's my attempt in a very short lecture to give you a sense of the flow of the history. What has made the Episcopal Church what it is today? What are the roots of that church in history, and how various events in history have shaped us? You can see here a picture of Henry VIII, often somewhat erroneously considered the founder of the Church of England. So here's the history of the church in a nutshell. We're going to talk about the early history of the Catholic Church in England, its Roman, Celtic, and Saxon roots. All three of those are important in the foundation of the Christian Church, the Catholic Church in Britain. And then, of course, the cataclysm of the Reformation and how that gave rise to and shaped the Church of England. And then how that church in England came to America and how the Episcopal Church split off and became its own denomination. So we're going to kind of look at all three of these areas in our class tonight. As always, I should mention that you're welcome to email me questions. My email is ericw, E-R-I-C-W, at stpfeeds.org, and I'll be happy to include them in future classes. So the legend of how Christianity came to Britain is that in 63 A.D., the year of our Lord, Joseph of Arimathea, who had prepared the tomb for Jesus and brought with him the Holy Grail, came to Glastonbury, and there he brought this first, he was like the first apostle of this new Christian church in Britain. That was the Holy Grail, of course, was made fun of in the great Monty Python movie, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But it gave rise to this great tradition of legends in Britain that centered around King Arthur and the search for the Holy Grail. King Arthur trying to ground his kingdom in this iconic connection to Christ. And in the midst of a time of darkness in Britain, of raids by different tribes, which we'll talk about, there was this legend of King Arthur. Whether Arthur existed or not, we don't know. But certainly it was the most powerful story told in Britain for century after century, retold and retold, from Welsh legends to the first stories of King Arthur, and then retold and retold in French and in German, over and over again. Even to this day, we still are having movies and stories about King Arthur. The actual history is probably less romantic and dramatic. Christianity spread to Britain gradually from the late first century, so not very long after the time of the apostles, and found a foothold in various places and tribes at different times. And Britain at that time was not a unified rule, right? There was no king. There were these petty chieftains. There were warlike bands that kind of controlled little pockets of territory. And so when the chief heard about Christianity and was converted, the whole tribe became Christian, and then they warred with other tribes, and if they beat them, they also would become Christian. And so Christianity kind of slowly spreads here and there throughout Britain and gets established in Ireland, which becomes very important later on. And what's interesting is that there are various traditions and practices. There's no kind of universal Catholic Church at that time. It really was kind of messy. We like things to be neat and tidy, but it was quite messy. There were different traditions that came from Rome, different ones that the Irish established, and that also became important as we went along. The first British martyr that we know of is St. Alban. He was in the 3rd century, a Roman soldier. So Britain was under Roman occupation through this period. And he's a Roman soldier who, again, by tradition, we don't have a lot of evidence for this, but met a missionary priest who had come from Europe and was trying to convert people to Christianity. He was fleeing from an impious prince, probably one of these chieftains who didn't want Christianity in his tribe. And so he was looking for a hiding place. Alban is impressed with this priest. He welcomes him into his home. And when the soldiers came looking for him, Alban, sort of on the spur of the moment, decides to trade places with the priest, puts on the priest's robes, and so that the priest can go about his missionary work. and Alban is killed, martyred for that. There's a cathedral in St. Albans, north of London. And just quick aside, when I was visiting Britain some years ago, I walked in, a friend was running some errands, so he dropped me at the cathedral. He knew I love churches. So I'm wandering around and I look over in the choir area, and there's something going on. I go over and there's a table, and someone is signing books. There's about maybe 15 people waiting in line to have their book signed, and I look, and it's the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, who had just retired, and he had written a book, and so he was there signing books. So my visit to St. Alban got to meet the Archbishop of Canterbury. So you never know what you're going to find. So I mentioned Ireland in around 400 AD. And again, we don't have lots of written records from before this time, but around 400 AD, St. Patrick, not a saint yet, is brought from probably Wales. There's all kinds of legends about where Patrick is from, but being Welsh, I like the story that he came from Wales. And he is brought to Ireland as a slave. Most of Ireland was under the control of chieftains who would go on raiding expeditions along the coast of Britain, and they would go and raid a town and take back children as slaves to be raised as workers in their chiefdoms there. So Patrick lives most of his childhood in Ireland as a slave. He escapes when he's a young adult and decides that he's going to return to Ireland and become a missionary. So there were lots of legends about where Patrick was trained. It's possible, and from the stuff I've read, that he actually went to Rome and was trained as a deacon and maybe a priest later in Rome. And so he brings Roman Catholicism to Ireland. And there's all kinds of wonderful legends about him and his companions as they are trying to evade the chieftains and get to the people and share the good news with them. One of the stories is my favorite, where he is being chased by some soldiers and performs a miracle. He and his companions are transformed into deer so that the soldiers won't recognize them, and the soldiers go on along, and then they change back into human beings. And so one of the hymns attributed to St. Patrick is the Cry of the Deer, to remember that story and legend. The Celtic saints had wonderful stories and legends. St. David in Wales, the story was wherever he preached, a hill would spontaneously rise up so that people could see and hear him. He had a meeting with 4 other saints. There were lots of saints apparently in Wales, and the 5 hills grew up spontaneously where they met. And so to that day, there's a little town called Five Saints with 5 hills. So I love all those stories. The Celtic Christianity that Patrick came back with and his followers into England didn't really take hold everywhere. And there were these periodic raids by Germanic tribes, the Saxons. So if you think of the history of Britain being tribe after tribe coming and conquering and then being pushed to the side, you have probably a sort of native group that we don't know as much about. And then the Celts probably came over from Spain. The Gaels were another tribe that came over. The Jutes, the Saxons were a Germanic tribe. So the Saxons are this warlike Germanic people, and they come and they immediately start defeating the local Celtic tribes. And they were not Christian, and so they reestablished paganism even in places where Christianity had begun to take hold. In that context, we have the first major missionary effort from the church in Rome, which is now getting more organized. St. Gregory the Great, the Pope at the time, was somebody who really helped to organize the early Catholic Church. We call Gregorian chant because he codified that into a book of rules and for singers in the Catholic Church. And he also did a lot of missionary work. And so the story was that he saw 2 British slaves in Rome who had blonde hair. And he said, "Who are these angels?" And they said, "No, they're not angels, they're Angles," which was one of the tribes of Britain. And he said, "We can't leave them without the gospel." And so he convinces Augustine who is a priest, to lead a missionary trip to Britain. Now, Augustine did not want to go. Nobody wanted to go to Britain. It was cold, it was wet. Remember, many of these people were living in Italy where it's sunny and warm and nice, and Augustine had no desire to be a missionary, and yet he went, and he established a church at Canterbury in the very south east part of England. And from there, he and his followers reintroduce Roman Catholicism to that part of England. So picture this kind of crazy patchwork quilt of Britain at that time. We've got pockets of Saxon paganism. We've got Celtic Christianity in Ireland and in Wales and in parts of England. And we have Roman Catholicism in other parts, all with different traditions and different practices and beliefs. So I don't know if you ever read the book by Thomas Cahill, How the Irish Saved Civilization. Wonderful book. But one of the key things that happens is the Irish monks establish centers of learning. Think of the Book of Kells, right? They're writing these beautiful manuscripts. They're educated, they're more civilized. And so they decide to bring their learning and Christianity back to England. So Christianity is coming up from Canterbury in the southeast, the Roman Catholicism, and then from the Irish in the north, they establish monasteries in the north of England, at Iona, in Lindisfarne, the Holy Isle, and at Jarrow, which is today Newcastle. And these monasteries really form the basis of Christianity in the north. So over time, what happens is we have Celtic Christianity more in the north of England, in Wales and in Ireland. The Scots, God help the Scots, who knows what was happening up there. But in the south of England, we have more of Augustine's Roman Catholicism. And eventually, as Christianity spreads more and more and takes more hold in Britain, there's a slight problem. What are we going to do about these two forms of Christianity which are competing for the hearts and minds of people? So in the year 664, King Oswiu of Northumbria in the north of England, he brought together a synod in Whitby. And the great figure of that synod was the abbess of the monastery there, Hilda, who was the equal of bishops. And we think of women not having a role in the church, but in the Middle Ages, many women rose to great prominence in the church as abbesses of convents or monasteries. In Ireland, there were even sort of co-ed monasteries, some of which were led by women. So the picture wasn't all the way we often think of a completely male-dominated society. In fact, Hilda presides over this synod, and the goal is to bring harmony and peace between two different forms of Christianity. Finally, King Oswiu rules, after listening to everybody, that his kingdom will observe Easter. One of the two issues were Easter was calculated differently and monks shaved their heads differently. That was their tonsure. There were some other customs as well. But he rules that they will follow the Roman Catholic practice and not the Celtic practice. This is all recorded by the greatest historian of English history of that time, the Venerable Bede. My first cat was the Venerable Bede. I miss him. But he wrote a history of the English church and people in 731. And it's his account that we really draw upon for the details about this. At any rate, by that time, we finally have a kind of clarity of how the Catholic Church is going to proceed in Britain. Until the year 1066. Here's a little clip from the Bayeux Tapestry, I believe, which marks the Norman conquest of England. In 1066, one of the dates we all memorized in school, the Normans, who were originally sort of descendants of Vikings, they were Northmen, that's what Norman means, but they had settled down in Sicily and had become very powerful, and their leader decided to venture forth and conquers England in 1066, William the Conqueror, as he's known. And they brought French language. They spoke French, not the Saxon or Anglo-Saxon or Celtic Anglo-Saxon or hodgepodge of languages that were in Britain at that time, they bring French as the main language. They also replace, get this, all of the bishops in Britain at that time and other officials, right? Everybody. There's like a complete lopping off of the head of Britain. King Harold, actually, the Saxon king, was killed in the Battle of Hastings. But the church is reorganized along Norman lines, not Celtic or Anglo-Saxon lines anymore. So all the bishops are French, but the priests are largely still Saxon and Celtic. So there's kind of a chaos that's going on in the church. The other thing that the Normans brought was a much more monarchical view of how the church should run. So in Celtic monasteries, things were somewhat democratic. There was a sense of communal organization and leadership. In the Roman Catholic system, of course, bishops were appointed by the Pope. And the Normans had a different view. They wanted power over appointing bishops who were secular as well as religious leaders. And so there was a huge controversy between the new kings of England, the Norman kings of England, and the Pope over who had control over the church. And this went on for hundreds of years and also laid some of the foundation for the conflict that we'll see when it comes to Henry VIII. There was a tradition that goes all the way back to 1066 of the king wanting control of the church. In 1170, King Henry at the time is famously quoted as saying about Thomas a Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was pushing for more freedom of the church. He really wanted the church to have freedom from the state. And Henry says, probably a little drunk, he says, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And 3 of his thugs immediately went out, found Thomas a Becket in the cathedral. And, this is Thomas a Becket, not the Bayeux Tapestry. They kill Thomas a Becket while he's saying Mass at Canterbury Cathedral. So things were tough. There was a lot of tension between church and state in the 12th century. This underlays, I think you'll see, a lot of the tension and the crisis that comes to a head in the 16th century. Speaking of the 16th century, a bombshell hits Europe when a monk, an Augustinian Roman Catholic monk named Martin Luther, who is a biblical scholar, protests some of the abuses of the church of his day and writes kind of today it would be a tweet, right? It would be a Facebook post, but he had to actually write it on paper. And he goes over to the church doors, the church in Wittenberg, where he was a professor at the university, and he nails the paper to the door, famously on October 31st, 1517. And his 95 Theses, his rant about the abuses of the church, touches off an absolute powder keg that was lying dormant in Europe at that time. A lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of church-state tensions. Some of the princes in Germany did not like paying taxes to Rome. Rome was demanding a tithe. The Pope was building St. Peter's Basilica, and the Catholic Church in that time, especially in Germany, had gone on just a kind of sordid, we would say, search for funds. They were sending around these friars to basically round up money to fund St. Peter's Basilica, which is an amazing, enormous place. One of them, Johannes Tetzel, was the one that irritated Martin Luther, because Tetzel would have this little ditty, apparently, where he would go around to people and say, "You can buy your way out of purgatory. If you give to this project, the Pope has blessed this project of St. Peter's Basilica, and if you just give me some money, you can skip the whole purgatory thing. You don't have to say masses for your soul. You don't have to do your time. You can just get out of purgatory free. As soon as the coin in the coffers rings, the soul from purgatory springs," was his little saying. And Martin Luther thought this was horrific and went against everything that the church should stand for. And it was part of what led him to his rebellion. So there were a bunch of issues, right? Money and power, But Martin Luther also claimed that the worship of the church should be in the vernacular, in the language of the people. Very few people in Europe now spoke Latin. It was the language of the monks and the very educated people, but the common people did not speak Latin. So he said worship should be in German or English or French or whatever the local language was. This was a huge one. The Bible should be translated into the language of the people, and it should be available to ordinary Christians. This is huge. He claimed that celibacy could not be found in the Bible as a rule, that the Catholic Church had imposed this on its clergy, but that it should be an option and not required, and that there should be married clergy. He claimed that the sacraments should still be practiced in the church, but they should be free and available to all. And he held that there should still be bishops and ordained clergy. So his, and his main issue of all, and he wrote this in his commentary on the book of Romans, was that salvation could not be earned by good works, not by giving money, not by doing good, not by acts of penitence or contrition or so forth, that salvation was ultimately and completely the work of God, that we are saved by Christ's death on the cross, that grace is given to us through faith and through our baptism, and that we cannot earn it. We can only respond in gratitude. So those were the key issues that touched off the Protestant Reformation. Now, many other leaders took this ball and ran with it in ways that Luther did not approve of, like John Calvin and Zwingli and many others, but this was the core of what Luther held to. So in England at that time, Henry VIII is king, and he is closely allied with the Pope. We don't often remember that, but Henry VIII was actually named by the Pope as defender of the faith because he wrote a book condemning Luther. So the head of England's state, and he would have said also the church, as the king, divinely ordained as the king, he writes a book condemning Luther and upholding the Catholic faith in England. But there was trouble on the horizon. His wife, Catherine, who was a cousin of the Pope, could not have a son. So she has a daughter, Mary, but she can't have a son. And so Henry has married her. She was his brother's wife. Arthur was supposed to be king. Henry was never supposed to be king. King Arthur, think about that. King Arthur was finally going to come back to rule Britain. How symbolic. But Arthur dies young, and Henry marries her, but no sons, which is a crisis for the monarchy. So Henry tries everything to get around this. He says, well, okay, I need a son. Maybe I could do it with another woman. So he asks the Pope for an annulment or a divorce. Now, divorce was not really done, but annulments were. And so, rich and famous people often get annulments. And he thought, I just, make a donation to St. Peter's, we'll be all set. No, the Pope is having none of it. The Pope is related to Catherine. He's not giving Henry what he wants. And so Henry divorces her anyway. The Pope excommunicates Henry. Henry stops paying the tithe to Rome, which is a huge amount of money. It's probably what Henry wanted more than anything, was to stop paying 10% of all of his revenue to Rome. He was busy fighting wars with the King of France and needed revenue all the time. Henry remarries, famously. He remarries 5 more times. He has another daughter with Anne Boleyn, Queen Elizabeth. He has finally a son, Edward, with Jane Seymour. Henry sets up things for Edward. He's now in very poor health near the end. So he sets up regents who will take over and run the country because Edward is too young to be king. Henry dies a Catholic. He never converted to anything else. He died a Catholic. He was excommunicated, but he died a Catholic. But interestingly, he appoints Protestants as his son's regents. So Protestantism has been taking hold in Britain despite him. It's been kind of creeping in. And so he names a number of these people to be regents, knowing that as soon as he dies, they are going to radically change the church in England, which is what happens. So now we enter a very tumultuous time. Edward reigns from 1547 only for about 6 years. He also dies young. But during those 6 years, England officially becomes a Protestant country. The regents make sure that Catholicism is driven underground. The Archbishop of Canterbury at that time, Thomas Cranmer, is charged with creating the first English Book of Common Prayer. This will be the Book of Common Prayer for this new Church of England. He bases it largely on the Roman Mass, on the Roman Missal, and includes rites for Holy Eucharist, the Great Litany, morning prayer, and evening prayer. That's basically what goes in that first prayer book. And it stays fairly, we would say, Catholic. It's translated into English. There's some parts that are taken out, less devotion to the saints and Mary, but it's, recognizable as something that was close to the Mass that would have been in Latin up to that time. Well, Edward's regents don't like it. They want a more extreme form of Protestantism. They want to get rid of all the Catholic trappings and wording. And so he publishes a new prayer book in 1552. This one is much more based on more radical Protestant theology. Well, in 1553, Edward falls ill and dies, just like his uncle Arthur had. And so who's next in line? No more sons. So Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, becomes the queen. She's been living in Spain. She had married a Spaniard, a Spanish prince. And so she and her husband, with the backing of the Spanish monarchy, restore Roman Catholicism to England as the state religion. Tumultuous times indeed. Cranmer and other leading reforming churchmen, the Protestants, are burned at the stake. They're offered the option, recant and become Catholic again, or burn. And so they burn. And that's why she's nicknamed Bloody Mary. Now, we have to be fair. The Protestants were burning Catholics as well. There was a bloody sides to both. But she gets the nickname Bloody Mary, because the victors often rewrite the history in their favor. So she's Bloody Mary. And she ends up burning 283 Protestant heretics. So there was a cost to being a Protestant in those days. So Mary now dies very soon of influenza in 1558. And now Britain is faced with another child of Henry. They've been through Edward, they've been through Mary, and finally it's Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who was Henry's second wife. And Elizabeth comes to reign in 1558. She reigns for nearly 50 years. And this is really important. If you can see all the chaos of having these short reigns up till then, her reign establishes a sense of stability, and she is finally able to bring about a kind of, I don't want to say compromise, but she establishes what becomes the DNA of the Church of England. In my view, not Henry VIII, but his daughter Elizabeth I is truly the founder of the Church of England. And I don't think it really starts. I don't count the King Edward time, really. I mean, it sort of does, but I think this is really the moment when the Church of England becomes what it is. And her goal is to bring about harmony between Catholics and Protestants. She wants to find a way for the British people to live together and to worship together in harmony. And so there's yet a third prayer book, right? We had 1549, which is more Catholic, 1552, which is more Protestant, and now the 1559, she tries to create this via media, this middle way between Catholicism and radical Protestantism. And that is the aim of that prayer book. She says famously, "I have no desire to make a window into men's minds. Do you believe like a Catholic? Fine. Just say the words that are in the prayer book. Are you a radical Protestant? Fine. Just say the words that are in the prayer book. Come to church, and this prayer book will be the way that you worship. Whether you think it's too Protestant or too Catholic, this is the one you got. People could believe whatever they wanted, but they would use a book of common prayer. And that is so essential to the identity of Anglicans, Episcopalians from that time to now. Throughout her whole reign, Catholics in Europe were trying to get rid of her. They wanted to return England to a Catholic country, and particularly the Spanish, which was the most powerful Catholic monarchy at the time. Remember, they had this massive presence in the New World. They had a giant navy, tons of wealth. They spent, just a huge amount of effort to try to assassinate Elizabeth, overthrow Elizabeth, and reestablish Catholicism. The major effort, of course, is in 1588, the Spanish Armada, which is sent to Britain to defeat the British and reestablish Catholicism. Through a whole series of interesting circumstances, the Spanish Armada should have won, but they were plagued by bad weather, by some bad decisions, and the Armada is completely destroyed. And the last hope, really, of overthrowing Elizabeth is ended, and England is Protestant forever. So let me give you a quick example of how this shook out in terms of the liturgy itself. So imagine that you're going to communion, and it's 1549. This is what the priest would say as you receive the sacrament. The body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. So let's think about that. What is this saying about the presence of Christ in the sacrament? Is this remember, the Protestants believed that nothing was really happening. It's just bread. We're just remembering the Last Supper. It's a memorial, not a real sacrament. Well, that's not what this says. This says this is the real body of our Lord Jesus Christ. It was given for you, and it has the power, because of its sacramental nature, to preserve your body and soul unto everlasting life. So this is very Catholic theology. Doesn't talk about transubstantiation per se, but it's very Catholic in its approach to the real presence of Christ in the sacrament. Here's what it read. If you went to church in that same church, 3 years later, it's 1552, we got a new prayer book. Here's what it would have said in 1552. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. Do you see the difference? Now the focus is not on the real presence of Christ. It is in the remembrance that Christ died for you. Okay, so it's more of a memorial. There's nothing magical or precious or sacred about this bread, except that it is a remembrance of the Last Supper. You're remembering that. It's making you reflect on your own self. Are you feeding on the real presence of Christ? No, you're feeding on him in your heart by faith with thanksgiving. So this is a much more Protestant view of communion. And it's fascinating to me that these were the two. So my favorite part of this is in 1559, when we get our third prayer book. So you're back at the same church. It's 7 years later. You got your third prayer book. This is now what the priest says. The body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. Which one did she pick? Which one did the church pick in 1559 for this new Via Media middle way prayer book? Well, they didn't choose one. They just stuck them both together. The Catholic theology stuck right on to the Protestant theology. I suppose when you came up to communion in 1559, you could sort of choose which one you were paying attention to as you received the sacrament and decided what it meant to you. But it's just fascinating to me. And this is the words These are the words, I'm sorry, that carried on through all the British prayer books, 1662. It came into 1789 in America, all the way up to our current prayer book, 1979. If you use Rite One, our more traditional language service, and you open that prayer book, you will see this exact formula. The Via Media persists from 1559 to 1979, and to today, we would say. So I just find that an interesting example of how this kind of played out. And it must have been so confusing to be an ordinary church person in Britain in those days. All right, so Elizabeth reigns until 1603, this long reign. It's fascinating to me, the longest reigning and most successful monarchs in British history, who've almost all been men, but the longest reigning and most successful are all women. Elizabeth I, who reigns for nearly 50 years. Victoria, who reigns for 60 years? And Elizabeth II, who just died, who reigned for a similar length of time. It's just kind of incredible. So anyway, Elizabeth dies. She has no children. She never gets married. She never has children. She plays off suitors, but she never actually has a child, an heir. And so what are they going to do? Now there's no more children of Henry. There's no children of Elizabeth. And so they have to look for a new monarch. And they find Elizabeth's cousin, who is King James VI of Scotland. He is invited by Parliament to become the King of England. And so he comes down and he becomes James I of England. And his last name, Stuart, becomes the new dynasty. So the Tudors were Henry and Mary and Edward and Elizabeth. And now we have the Stuarts. But the Stuarts never really were popular in England. James I's son, Charles I, was actually beheaded because the Protestants in Parliament were desirous of overthrowing the king and establishing a commonwealth. And so we have this fascinating, weird period in British history from 1649 to 1660 where there is no king. The Puritans, who were the Protestants, the radical Protestants in Parliament, they are running the country as if it were Geneva, Switzerland. They're trying to make it in the image of this kind of Protestant utopia, but it doesn't really turn into a utopia. It doesn't sit well with the British people, and there were problems in Ireland and kind of a mess. Oliver Cromwell is the general who becomes the Lord Protector. He will not take the title of king, but he's really running the country almost as a dictatorship with the backing of Parliament. When Cromwell died, Parliament has had enough of these Protestants, and so they invite Charles II, another Stuart, to become king. And so Charles comes back. He's been hiding out in exile in, I think, France. He comes back to England and becomes the king. Charles II is very much a Roman Catholic sympathizer, as is James II, who will succeed him. But during this time, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer becomes the official book of prayer book, and it still remains. They've never replaced the 1662 book. They've had supplemental prayers. Like if you go to a parish church in England today, you probably won't get the 1662 book. You'll probably get a modern supplement, but the official prayer book is still 1662. Well, his son James tries to reinstitute Roman Catholicism. So the sympathies towards Roman Catholicism have come all the way back. And the British Parliament is not having this. They remember the stories of Queen Mary. They remember the chaos of going back and forth from Protestant to Catholic. And that is the last straw for them. And so they fire James II. They don't behead him, but they fire him. And they invite his daughter Mary, who has married Prince William in Holland. They invite the two of them to become king and queen. So think of how the monarchy has changed. Now Parliament is telling the kings and queens who they can be, right? They fire one king and bring another king in. The power balance has shifted and Parliament is firmly in control. So this, let me go back for a second. This this what's called Glorious Revolution again fends off the threat that Roman Catholicism would take over in Britain again, and keeps Britain in a sort of moderate Protestant via media way. So that's, I think, the takeaway from that. So again, during this period, the British and many other countries are establishing colonies in the New World. We talked about Spain and Portugal, but now England has become quite a power, and they're colonizing all over the place and establishing what becomes the British Empire. In the American colonies at that time, there is this amazing diversity of different nations and languages and religions. And so it's kind of fun. I don't know if you can see, if this is working here, but if you can see the map, the shading of the different predominant religions in the first 13 colonies. There's a lot of Anglicans, right? Because the English are spreading all through the colonies in New England, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Virginia is actually named not for the Virgin Mary, but for the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. So that's Anglican. There's also a strong presence of the Congregational, which was the inheritors of the Puritans. They become known as the Pilgrims, right? And they settle in Plymouth Rock in the 1600s. Contrary to popular belief, they did not come to America for religious freedom. They had religious freedom when they went to Holland. They came to America to establish a religious dictatorship. So the Massachusetts and New England areas are very rigidly Puritan. No celebration of Christmas, no hymn singing, no, very, very strict conservative Puritan type religion in those areas. We also have many others. We have Lutherans coming into Pennsylvania and to New York. We have Presbyterians. Later on, we have Baptist, Roman Catholic, even Jewish settlers in the New World, Dutch, German, French, Reformed churches, the Huguenots. There's beautiful old Huguenot churches in South Carolina, for example. And then the Quakers. William Penn in Pennsylvania is famously a Quaker. So there's this amazing diversity of religious groups in the New World, of which the Church of England is one, a strong one. But things are brewing which will cause problems for the Church of England. So what was the church like before the Revolution? It was a missionary area. There were no bishops in the colonies, no Anglican bishops. All Anglicans were under the authority of the Bishop of London, who kind of was the administrator of the whole of the Church of England in America. And this caused problems. You can't have confirmation services. You can't have ordinations. If you want to have a priest, they have to go all the way back to England to be ordained and come back. And in those days, travel was not very safe or reliable. So it was kind of a mess. The church tried to solve this by creating missionary societies, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, I think it is. They sent priests to serve for a limited time. They'd do a stint in America and then go back. One of those priests was John Wesley, who later founded the Methodist Church. He was an Anglican missionary priest from the SPG, I think it was. So one of the things that happens, and this is what I want you to think about, is with no bishops and very few resident clergy, right? All your clergy are outsiders, basically foreigners from England. The administration and leadership of the church in America, the Anglican Church in America, became very lay-led. So parish vestries, lay ministers, lay readers, lay preachers, they become really important in the American church, much more so than any other part of the Church of England or the Anglican Communion around the world. And that's had quite a legacy for us even today. Well, when the Revolution happens, there's a crisis for the Church of England, because guess what? We're the Church of England. So when we declared independence from Great Britain, what were we going to do? what is the leadership of the church going to do? Because all Church of England clergy had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. So when the country declared independence, clergy had two options. One, forswear their oath and remain Americans, or honor their oath and flee to Canada or back to England. Many clergy fled to Canada and to England. Very few were left in America. And the remaining churches were cut off from their bishop in London and needed to completely reinvent the church. This was kind of a make or break moment. The Episcopal Church might never have existed. The Church of England might just have imploded and not remained. But instead, a group of leaders gathered together and figured out a way forward. And so the Episcopal Church is created. There's several meetings that take place in Philadelphia, which was the capital at the time. And over time, several key things happen. One is we get our first bishop. So in New England, Samuel Seabury, who's from Connecticut, he goes to Scotland. The English bishops will not consecrate an American bishop because we're still at war. So Seabury goes to Scotland, and the Scottish bishops, and here's a picture, I hope I'm not blocking you here, but this is a picture of the cathedral in Aberdeen where 3 Scottish Anglican bishops laid hands on Samuel Seabury and made him the first American bishop. So he comes back to America. He was a fairly proud man and didn't get along well always with others. And so there's a general convention held, and he decides he's not going. He doesn't like what the other people are doing because he wants to preside. He's the bishop, right? He wants to be in charge. And they don't want him to be because they're not from New England. So they, in 1785, call the first General Convention, name themselves the Protestant Episcopal Church, and then figure out, they send a couple other people to England. Once they find out the Archbishop of Canterbury will now ordain bishops for the United States, they send 2 of their members, William White from Philadelphia and Samuel Provost from New York. They are priests who sail to England and are made bishops by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So this now offers, with 3 bishops, you can ordain new bishops. This is the seeds that allows the American church to continue. And so in 1789, the first really general convention of the Episcopal Church is held in Philadelphia. William White is chosen as the presiding bishop, and they set up the whole structure of the Episcopal Church. We'll talk some more about this in a future class, but essentially they model themselves on the new Constitution of the United States, which has a president, not an archbishop, but a presiding bishop, right, who's like the president. There are 2 houses, a house of bishops, which is like the Senate, and a house of deputies, which is like the House of Representatives. And that is how the church will be governed. And they published the first American Book of Common Prayer. So I really look at 1789 as kind of the birth of the Episcopal Church. There's those steps that led up to it, but 1789 is really when it's formed. So as the church goes into the 19th century, it faces just one struggle after another, is the way I kind of look back at it. I'm sure it felt different to the people living through it, but for me, it's just quite striking to see all the challenges that the church faced. For one thing, it was still seen as too English. So in post-revolutionary America, this new Protestant Episcopal Church struggled with membership and leadership. We were never a large church. We only had been because we were the state church, right, for those colonies which were English. Just like in England, the Church of England is still the state church. That gave us certain kind of legitimacy and strength. But without that, we were kind of lost. And many of the clergy had fled to Canada. So we were short on clergy. We were seen as still a little suspect because of our ties to England, and not American enough. And so the churches that really grew were churches like the Methodist Church, which had a very strong missionary impulse. You think of the circuit riders, right? These Methodist ministers who would go on horseback and cover, hundreds and hundreds of miles and plant churches and see to them in this kind of circuit riding mentality. Whereas Episcopalians tended to be more concentrated in the cities. Think New York and Boston and Alexandria, Virginia, and so forth. That tended to be our concentration, more urban, more English, and less missionary. And so we were quickly overtaken by the Methodists and later by the Baptists. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were these phenomena known as Great Awakenings, these kind of big preaching revivals. It seems to me sometimes like modern Christians kind of want to redo the Great Awakenings, because there were just thousands of people who would gather to hear preachers and to have this emotional experience. This also was a challenge for the Episcopal Church because we tended to be much more cerebral, much more, dare I say, boring. And, our hymns were old English hymns. We tended to have intellectual sermons. We tended to be more highbrow. And so the spirit of the age, which was caught up in this emotional, spiritual experience of these great awakenings, we were really left behind in that kind of movement. And so we saw the growth out west as we went into the Midwest, places like God-forsaken places like Michigan. There weren't very many Episcopal churches, much more Methodist movement out this way and into the frontier and beyond. Then the issue of slavery and the Civil War divided all of the churches, including the Episcopal Church. Southern Episcopalians were pro-slavery for the most part. Northern Episcopalians were anti-slavery, and so there was a real kind of schism, and that also was a challenge for the church. The Reformed Episcopal Church, I believe, was founded at that time as a Southern pro-slavery Episcopal Church. Mostly the, let me go back a second here. Mostly the after the Civil War, the Episcopal Church came back together. So after that, really that crisis, the decision was made to reunite. Some churches didn't. Some stayed separated. But we did reunite after the Civil War. All right, whizzing through the later 19th and 20th centuries, let me talk about a few milestones. We can't cover everything, but I'm really happy to answer questions or follow up later on. The first African-American priest is ordained in 1804, Absalom Jones. He has a rough time of it and eventually leaves to found the African Methodist Episcopal Church because he did not find a very comfortable home in the Episcopal Church. Sad to say, but 1804 is our first African-American priest. First African-American bishop is 1874, James Theodore Holly, who becomes bishop of, I want to say, Haiti, as a missionary bishop. The progress of women was quite slow in the Episcopal Church, slow compared to some other churches like the Unitarians and the Congregationalists. Think about this, it wasn't until 1970 that women were admitted as deputies to General Convention. So 1970, that's my lifetime. That's quite shocking to me when I read that statistic, thinking of all the women who were so important in the history of the Episcopal Church, but could not vote at General Convention until 1970. The struggle for ordination for women was a long one, ongoing. And then in 1974, several bishops were fed up with the slow progress of the Episcopal Church. And so they had an illegal service in Philadelphia and ordained 11 women as priests. In 1976, the General Convention finally bent to the pressure and allowed the ordination of women and also, quote unquote, regularized those ordinations. So those first 11 who had been illegal for 2 years were finally made legal. I got to work with one who was a really neat person. She was on the staff in our diocese in Western New York. Marie Fleischer was her name. In 1977, the first African-American woman priest is ordained. She was also a lawyer and a fascinating person. A college at Yale has just been named for her, and I want to learn more about her. She's just a fascinating person. In 1989, Barbara Harris is consecrated as the first woman bishop and the first African-American woman bishop in Boston. And then in 2003, General Convention approved the election of Gene Robinson, who had been elected by the Diocese of New Hampshire as their bishop. He was the first openly gay man to be elected a bishop, and the General Convention had to approve that, and that caused a lot of conversation, including here at St. Philip's. There were a lot of people unhappy about that and others who were overjoyed. And then in 2012, the General Convention approved an official liturgy to bless same-sex couples. And so that's kind of been some milestones. And we'll talk in a future class about the church and society and how the Episcopal Church has approached these kind of societal issues and controversies and conflicts. So that is my whirlwind tour through the history of the Episcopal Church. I hope you do have some questions and reflections. If I were to kind of give you a few things to kind of sum up, for me, there's several things that as I look at the church today, I think are still living legacies from the past. And one is that really deep history from the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon churches, right? This desire for a more participatory structure where people can have their voices heard, that really comes out of those Celtic and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Not so much out of the sort of monarchical Roman Catholic view, but more out of that indigenous kind of spirituality from the Celts and Anglo-Saxons. So that's a kind of living legacy that I see in the Episcopal Church today. I also see the via media, Elizabeth I's desire to have a church where people could find a way to worship together despite their differences. In her day, it was the Catholics and the radical Protestants. In our day, it's probably, Democrats and Republicans. We have constantly forces that want to pull us apart. And one of the legacies of our history has been a desire to have a kind of comprehensive community where all can find a place and be welcome. It's not easy and it's never comfortable and it's not really satisfying because we want to be, so rah-rah in one way. Let's just pick an idea and go with it. But we want to keep holding these tensions and holding these differences in our communion. And I think that's deeply rooted in the history of the Episcopal Church. And then our desire to again comprehensively embrace our Roman Catholic traditions of the sacraments, the ordained ministries of the church, bishops, priests, and deacons, and also wed that to a faith that embraces some of the best of Protestantism, which is a desire for a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, access to the Holy Scriptures, knowledge of the Scriptures, and the ability to think and interpret for ourselves. So those two pieces in our tradition and history, I think, are so vital. They remain vital for my own personal faith and understanding. So that's just a few things that I think about. Where does the church go from here? That's for you to decide, right? Or for all of us to decide how we build upon this legacy, how we strive to meet the challenges of today. The increasing pace of change and technology, the ethical problems of gene editing and artificial intelligence, right? How is the church going to speak to these issues? How are we going to work in a society where there's such a great divide between the 1% or the 1/10 of 1% who hold so much of the resources and the rest who are often without? How do we speak to those issues, right? How do we take our great traditions and legacies and live them out in this new world? That's the challenge. And It's my hope that with some of this background, you'll be more equipped to be able to speak out of this tradition and history. And again, I welcome your thoughts, comments, and your questions. Next month, we're going to wait till the 19th of January to have our next session, which will be on our beliefs and theology. So fasten your seatbelts as we delve deep into the theology of the church and explore in more depth what that via media looks like in terms of our beliefs and theology.